Hey, welcome back to the Nero world. Today we're diving into another Nero Wolfe mystery, smart, sharp, and worth every minute. The orchids were being difficult that Tuesday morning, which put Wolfe in a mood that could charitably be described as thunderous. I had heard him stomp down from the plant rooms at 11 o'clock, settle his considerable bulk into the reinforced chair behind his desk, and demand that Fritz bring beer with a tone usually reserved for announcements of approaching catastrophe. By the time I'd finished my third cup of coffee and was halfway through the morning crossword, he had consumed 2 bottles of Remmers and was glaring at the far wall as though it owed him money. "The Phalaenopsis amabilis," he said to no one in particular, "is an ungrateful organism." "I'll put that on a sampler," I said. "We can hang it next to the Renoir." He looked at me with the expression he reserves for comments he finds beneath acknowledgement, which is to say roughly 70% of everything I say. Then the doorbell rang. I went to the hall and checked the one-way glass panel we'd had installed after the third time someone had tried to deliver trouble along with the mail. On the stoop stood a woman of perhaps 42, dressed in a charcoal wool coat that had not been purchased at any establishment I could name without a French dictionary. She carried a bag, crocodile, genuine, not the department store approximation, and held herself with the particular rigidity of someone who had spent considerable effort learning to look composed, and was currently spending every ounce of that effort. I opened the door. "Archie Goodwin," I said, "I work for Mr. Wolfe." "I know who you are." Her voice was controlled, educated, with the faint crispness of someone raised in Connecticut money. "I'm Miriam Halstead. I called this morning." She had, in fact. At 9:15, a woman had called, given that name, refused to state her business to me, and asked for an appointment. I had told her 2 o'clock. Either she was eager or she was frightened, and given the state of her jaw muscles, I was betting on a combination of both. "You're early," I said. "Yes." She didn't apologize for it. I brought her to the office, made the introduction, and settled into my chair at the corner of Wolfe's desk with my notebook open, less because I expected to need it immediately, and more because it gives clients something to be nervous about other than Wolfe himself, which is a mercy. Wolfe looked at her. He does not stand when women enter. He has views on the subject that he has expressed at length, and which I will not reproduce here except to say they involve the word flummery. But he does, when he finds a client worthy of his full attention, arrange his face into something that passes for courteous attention. He did so now. "Mrs. Halstead," he said, "you may proceed." She sat with the crocodile bag in her lap and looked at him steadily. "My husband is about to be arrested for murder," she said. "He didn't do it. I need you to find out who did." I wrote that down, mostly out of habit. "Who has been murdered?" Wolfe asked. "Douglas Fenner. He was a business partner of my husband's, a co-director of Halstead Fenner Capital. He was found dead in his home office 4 days ago. The police say he was struck with a bronze paperweight." She paused. "The paperweight was my husband's. It was a gift from our daughter, with his initials engraved on it. Apparently it had been in Douglas's office for some months. My husband claims he lent it to him, and the police find this explanation unsatisfying. The police find everything about my husband unsatisfying at the moment. They've spoken to him 3 times. His lawyer called me this morning and said to expect an arrest within 48 hours. She looked down at the bag in her lap, then back up. "My husband is not a violent man, Mr. Wolfe. He's a careful, methodical, occasionally infuriating man who clips coupons despite having a net worth of $11 million, and has not raised his voice in 23 years of marriage. He did not beat Douglas Fenner to death with a paperweight." "What was the state of the partnership?" Wolfe asked. She hesitated. It was a brief hesitation. 2 seconds, perhaps 3, but it was there, and I noted it. "There were tensions," she said. "There had been a disagreement about the direction of the fund. My husband wanted to pursue a more conservative strategy. Douglas was more aggressive in his investment philosophy." "Were legal proceedings contemplated?" Another hesitation. Shorter this time, as though she'd caught herself from the first, and was correcting. There had been some discussion of a dissolution. Nothing formal. "Money," Wolfe said, without particular inflection. "Money," she agreed. "What does your husband say about his whereabouts the night Mr. Fenner was killed?" "He was at the office until 8. Then he came home. I can confirm he arrived by 8:45. The medical examiner places Douglas's death between 7 and 10, so there is a window. 45 minutes. That's all they have, and the paperweight." She straightened in her chair. "Mr. Wolfe, I am not naive. I understand that a 45-minute window and a murder weapon bearing your husband's initials are not trivial. I am not asking you to perform a miracle. I am asking you to investigate, because I believe that when the truth is fully examined, my husband will be exonerated." Wolfe was quiet for a moment. He pressed his fingertips together, his thinking posture, which I always find somewhat theatrical, but which I have learned over years to respect as genuine. His eyes moved to the bookshelves, then to the window, then back to her. "Tell me about Douglas Fenner," he said. Something shifted in her face. It was subtle, a minute tightening around the eyes. "Divorced. He had a son from his marriage, Marcus, who works in finance in Chicago. He was charming, socially adept, and professionally ruthless in ways that my husband consistently underestimated." "You did not like him?" "No, I did not." She offered this without apology. "I thought he was using my husband's capital, reputation, and connections to build something he intended to eventually own outright. But disliking someone is not the same as murdering them, and my husband is the one who trusted him, not me. Who else was in Fenner's life professionally? Closely, I mean, not merely in passing." She considered. "There is Renata Voss. She was his chief analyst at the fund. Very capable, very ambitious, and this is my impression only, deeply resentful of her position relative to her contribution. She did most of the analytical work. Douglas presented it." "Anyone else?" "Gerald Prine. He was Fenner's personal attorney, handled his private affairs as well as his professional ones. They'd been close for years. Douglas trusted him with everything, which, given Douglas's character, means Prine knows things about him that no one else does." "And the son? Marcus Fenner?" "He and his father were estranged, from what I understand. There was a falling out over money. The son felt Douglas had manipulated his inheritance from his mother's estate. I don't know the details." Wolfe was still again. Outside, a truck passed on West 35th Street. Fritz appeared soundlessly in the doorway, caught my eye, and I shook my head fractionally. He retreated. "Mrs. Halstead," Wolfe said at last, "I will take your case. My fee is substantial and will be presented in writing by Mr. Goodwin. I will require full access to your husband. A conversation here, in this office, tomorrow morning if it can be arranged. I will also require that you withhold nothing. Not regarding the business disagreement, not regarding the dissolution discussions, and not regarding whatever it is you have thus far declined to tell me." She blinked. "I've told you everything relevant." "You've told me everything you've judged relevant, which is a different and considerably less useful thing." His tone was not unkind, but it was implacable. "There is something you are holding in reserve. I don't require it this moment. You don't yet trust me, which is rational. But you will need to provide it before we are done, or I will fail, and your husband will be arrested. I say this not to alarm you, but to establish the terms under which I work." She looked at him for a long moment. I watched her decide something. I could almost see the internal machinery of it, the weighing and the conclusion. "Tomorrow morning," she said, "I'll bring Edmund." When she had gone, I sat back down and looked at Wolfe. He had already reached for his book, a history of the Dutch East India Company that he'd been working through for a week, and appeared to have dismissed the world entirely. "She's holding something back," I said. "Obviously." He turned a page. "She's also frightened in a manner inconsistent with mere concern for her husband's legal situation." "You think she knows something about who did it?" "I think she suspects something she is not yet willing to confirm even to herself. There is a particular quality to reticence born of self-protection, and another quality to reticence born of protecting someone else. He paused. Mrs. Halstead exhibits both simultaneously, which is interesting. Want me to pull background on Fenner and this Renata Voss? Yes, and the attorney Prine and the son. He turned another page. Also the precise nature of the dissolution discussions. Partnership dissolutions, involving sums of significance, tend to generate paperwork, and paperwork tends to generate honesty in ways that conversation does not. I reached for the phone. You know, for a man who hasn't left the house since Thursday, you seem remarkably interested in other people's business. I am not interested in other people's business, he said, without looking up. I am interested in logic. Other people's business merely happens to be where the logic is currently located. I dialed the first number. Outside, the October light fell flat and gray on West 35th Street. Somewhere across town, a man named Edmund Halstead was presumably sitting in a very expensive apartment, wondering if the next knock at his door would be the police. And somewhere, in an office perhaps, or a club, or a taxi moving through midtown traffic, the person who had actually killed Douglas Fenner was going about their day. I have, over the years, developed a professional appreciation for the moment at the very beginning of a case, before the complications set in and the lies accumulate and things begin to get personally dangerous. There is a cleanness to it, a sense of the puzzle before you've seen enough pieces to know how ugly the picture is going to be. That feeling, I have also learned, never lasts. Edmund Halstead arrived the next morning at 10:15, which was after Wolfe had come down from the plant rooms and before he had finished his second beer, putting us in the narrow operational window during which he is willing to engage with the world without actively resenting it. He came with his wife and without his lawyer, which I took as either confidence or stubbornness. And given what she'd told us about coupon clipping, I suspected the latter. He was 60, lean in the way of men who have always been lean, rather than men who work at it, with gray hair cut close, and the careful evaluating eyes of someone accustomed to reading financial statements and finding the lie buried in the footnotes. He shook my hand with a firm, brief grip, looked around the office with an expression that suggested he found it either eccentric or impressive, and hadn't decided which, and sat down. My wife tells me you believe I'm withholding something. I'm not. Your wife tells you more than she intends, Wolfe observed. I said she was withholding something. I have not yet formed a conclusion about you. Halstead looked at his wife. She met his gaze with perfect composure, which told me this was a marriage of equals who had been managing each other's reactions for decades. Ask what you want to ask, Halstead said. In a moment. First, the paperweight. How did it come to be in Fenner's possession? I lent it to him 8 months ago. He admired it, said he needed something solid for his desk. He had a habit of fidgeting with objects while he talked on the phone. I brought it in one morning and left it on his desk. And you did not retrieve it. I forgot about it. It wasn't important to me. When did you last see it? A pause. I was in Douglas's office perhaps 6 weeks ago. I noticed it was still there. I considered taking it back and didn't bother. 6 weeks ago. What was the occasion for the meeting? Halstead's jaw tightened fractionally. We were discussing the dissolution. Describe those discussions. He took a breath and gave it to us straight, which I respected. The fund had been established 9 years ago with Halstead's capital and Fenner's market acumen. Over time, Fenner had leveraged his position to recruit additional investors, several of whom had personal loyalty to him rather than the partnership. In the last 2 years, Fenner had been systematically positioning himself to manage a majority of the fund's active assets, leaving Halstead with the institutional clients, reliable but less lucrative. There had been disputes over strategy. There had been a formal complaint filed by Halstead with the fund's oversight board, which had gone nowhere because 2 of the 3 board members had been brought in by Fenner. You were being squeezed out of your own company, I said. In plain terms, yes. He said it flatly, without self-pity. I had legal options. I was pursuing them. What were those options worth? Wolfe asked. In a dissolution favorable to me, perhaps 4 to 5 million above what Fenner was prepared to offer. He had engaged his own valuation firm. Their numbers were creative. $4 to $5 million, Wolfe said, represents a substantial motive. It represents my motive to keep Douglas Fenner alive and in litigation, Halstead said, with the first flash of real emotion I'd seen from him. Dead, he creates chaos. His estate goes into probate. His investors are spooked. 2 of my largest institutional clients have already called to ask whether the fund is stable. Whatever I might have won in a dissolution, I've likely lost in client flight in the last 4 days. He stopped himself. I did not kill Douglas, not because I was fond of him. I wasn't, particularly, not anymore, but because it would have been stupid, and whatever else I am not stupid. Wolfe looked at him for a long moment. No, he said, I don't believe you are. He shifted in his chair. Tell me about Renata Voss. It was the slightest thing, a flicker that passed between husband and wife so quickly that I nearly missed it. Nearly. She's the fund's chief analyst, Halstead said, extremely competent. Douglas relied on her heavily. Their relationship? Professional. Was it only professional? The pause was longer this time. Miriam Halstead spoke first. There were rumors, she said carefully. I have no knowledge of anything beyond that. Douglas was recently divorced, Halstead added. He had a tendency to. He found professional relationships convenient for other purposes. Did Ms. Voss share that tendency? I don't know. I didn't manage Douglas's personal life. I made a note. Wolfe moved on. Gerald Prine, how well do you know him? I know him through Douglas. They were close for a long time. Prine handled his divorce, his estate planning, a careful, private man, smart. Was Prine involved in the dissolution discussions? On Douglas's side, yes. He reviewed everything Douglas's legal team produced. And Marcus Fenner? Something crossed Halstead's face. Something I could only describe as uncomfortable. I met him once, 2 years ago, at a fund dinner. He and Douglas barely spoke to each other. What is your understanding of their estrangement? Douglas told me Marcus felt he'd been cheated in his mother's estate. He said it was a misunderstanding. Douglas's characterization of things was generally that whatever had gone wrong was a misunderstanding. I wrote that down. It was, I thought, as precise an epitaph for a certain type of man as I'd ever heard. That afternoon, I went out and did what Wolfe calls legwork, and what I call the actual work. I visited Halstead Fenner Capital's Midtown offices, presented myself as a journalist doing a piece on the fund's stability, a cover that required no creativity, given that 2 financial reporters were in the lobby asking the same question in earnest, and managed a 20-minute conversation with a junior analyst named Price, who in the way of junior analysts, when authority is absent and anxiety is high, talked more than he should have. What I got? Renata Voss had not come in since Fenner's death. She had called in on the first day and not been heard from since. The office manager had twice contacted her without response. This was notable because by all accounts, she was the operational center of the fund, and her absence in a crisis was, as young Price put it, really not like her. What I also got, Gerald Prine had appeared at the offices the morning after the murder, before the police in fact, and had spent 2 hours with the office manager. He had asked to see Fenner's calendar and correspondence files. He had been told by the manager that she couldn't authorize that. He had left without argument, which Price found odd, because Prine was not, in his experience, a man who left without getting what he came for. I put these items in my notebook and walked 3 blocks east to a diner, where I had a turkey sandwich, and thought about what people do in the hours after a murder, when they think no one is watching. Renata Voss went silent. Gerald Prine went to the office before the police did. Those were 2 very different reactions, and both of them were more interesting than crying. I called the office from a payphone and gave Wolfe both facts. There was a silence on his end, that lasted long enough that I checked to make sure the connection was still active. "Come home," he said. "I want to think." I did. He was at his desk when I returned. The beer untouched, the Dutch East India Company apparently forgotten, his eyes fixed on the middle distance. "Prine went for the files," I said, sitting down. "Yes." "Before the police?" "Yes." "That means he knew there was something in those files worth getting ahead of. Or worth removing." He picked up the beer at last and drank. "Mr. Archie, what do we know about the nature of attorney-client privilege in the context of a client's death?" "It survives, usually. The estate can waive it. And if the client's death is itself tied to something in those files?" I looked at him. "Then Prine's in a very uncomfortable position." "Precisely." He set the bottle down. "Get me everything you can find about Gerald Prine. Not his professional history. I want to know if he had any financial relationship with the fund itself. Investments, loans, anything of that nature." "You think Prine had a stake in Halstead Fenner?" "I think a man who has been someone's attorney for 15 years, and who rushes to secure that man's correspondence before the police arrive, is a man with interests that extend beyond the purely professional." He folded his hands. "I also want to speak with Renata Voss. You will find her. She's not returning calls." "Then don't call. Find her address and go there." He glanced at the clock. "Tomorrow. It's nearly time for dinner. Fritz is making rack of lamb with a tarragon jus, and I will not have it ruined by scheduling." I considered pointing out that a man's liberty was perhaps worth a slightly delayed dinner, but I have long since learned that there are arguments worth making with Nero Wolfe, and arguments that are purely recreational. I went to wash my hands instead, and by the time I returned to the dining room, the lamb smelled extraordinary, and I had temporarily ceased to feel guilty about it. That night, lying in bed with my notes spread on the coverlet, I made a list of the 4 people surrounding Douglas Fenner's death. Edmund Halstead, with his motive measured in millions, and his alibi measured in 45 minutes. Renata Voss, who had vanished into silence with an efficiency that suggested practice. Gerald Prine, who had moved on the files with a speed that suggested advanced preparation. And Marcus Fenner, the estranged son, who was somewhere in Chicago, with a grievance old enough to have calcified into something permanent. 4 people, 1 bronze paperweight, and somewhere in the arithmetic of motive, timing, and whatever Gerald Prine had been so determined to reach first, the truth. I turned off the light. The murder itself I should have described sooner. Let me do it now, because the details matter. They always do, and the ones that seem smallest tend to matter most. Douglas Fenner had been found by his housekeeper, a woman named Cecilia Rourke, at 7:15 on a Friday morning. She came in at 7 to prepare breakfast, found the ground floor lights still on, and discovered Fenner in his home office, which occupied the rear of his East 74th Street townhouse, slumped against the side of his desk. The bronze paperweight, roughly 8 inches long and shaped like a rearing horse, had been recovered near his right hand. He had been struck twice, once from behind, once, the medical examiner's conclusion, from above and to the left, as he was already falling. The second blow had been decisive. There was no sign of forced entry. The front door had been locked when Cecilia arrived, using her own key. The rear garden entrance, however, showed evidence of recent use. The deadbolt had been thrown from inside rather than locked from outside, suggesting that whoever left had exited through the garden and pulled the door shut behind them without locking it. Then thrown the deadbolt from inside was impossible. I'm simplifying. The point being that someone had left through the back. The police theory, as I had assembled it from 3 conversations with Inspector Kramer's office, and a longer one with Sergeant Pearlie Stebbins, who tolerates me to roughly the degree that a man tolerates a persistent splinter, ran as follows. Halstead had arrived at Fenner's townhouse sometime between 7:45 and 9 that Thursday evening. He and Fenner had argued. The dissolution was the assumed subject. The argument had become physical, and Halstead had struck Fenner with the first solid object to hand, which happened to be a paperweight bearing his own initials. He had then left through the garden, walked to the cross street, and eventually made his way home, arriving at 8:45 by Miriam Halstead's account. It was also, I had thought, from the moment Stebbins outlined it, over an irritable cup of bad coffee. Too clean. The issue was the paperweight's location. If you strike a man with an object in the heat of an argument, you do not set it down neatly. You drop it, throw it, leave it wherever your hand releases it, in the aftermath of violence. But the paperweight had been found within 2 feet of Fenner's right hand, on his right side, at a distance from the desk that suggested it had been placed rather than dropped. The police had noted this, and attributed it to Halstead having set it down deliberately, an attempt perhaps to obscure the fact that he'd used it. I found this logic unconvincing. If you want to obscure the fact that you've used a paperweight bearing your own initials, you take it with you. You do not place it beside the body, with the care of a man tidying up. I brought this to Wolfe, the morning after my diner lunch, along with everything I'd been able to gather on Prine's finances. The financial information had required a call to an accountant I know, in the Flatiron district, who has questionable ethics and an extraordinary memory for publicly available corporate filings. What he found, in 40 minutes of searching, was not complicated once you knew where to look. Gerald Prine was a limited partner in a vehicle called Fenner Capital Management LLC, a separate entity from the main fund, incorporated 3 years ago in Delaware, which held discretionary management authority over approximately $40 million in assets that had, over those 3 years, migrated from Halstead Fenner Capital into the newer vehicle. In other words, Fenner had been systematically siphoning assets from the partnership into a structure that gave him, and Prine, independent control. Halstead had been not merely squeezed, but actively stolen from. I presented this to Wolfe. He listened without moving, which is his highest form of attention. Prine was a co-beneficiary of the theft, he said, when I'd finished. $40 million worth of co-beneficiary, and if the dissolution had proceeded through litigation, this structure would have been discovered. Halstead's lawyers would have subpoenaed every entity associated with the fund. Which means, Wolfe said slowly, that Fenner's death, at this particular moment, may have been beneficial to Prine in ways that had nothing to do with Fenner personally. I let that sit for a moment. Prine went for the files to remove evidence of the LLC, I said. Or to establish what evidence remained. He may not have known the precise state of the paperwork. He tilted his head. This also reframes Ms. Voss. If she was the analytical engine of the fund, she would have known the numbers. She would have known what was being moved and where. Which means she either participated or she knew about it. Or both. He reached for his beer. Her silence takes on new dimension. She is not grieving. She is calculating. I have her address, I said. Upper West Side apartment. Go this afternoon. If she won't talk to me? He gave me the look that means the question is unworthy of an answer. I went. Renata Voss's building was on West 86th, a pre-war with a doorman who had the permanently suspicious expression of a man who has seen too many uninvited visitors. I gave him my name, asked him to ring Ms. Voss, and watched him do it with the elaborately bored competence of the experienced doorman. He told me she wasn't in. I told him I would wait. I waited 40 minutes, during which time the doorman and I reached an understanding of mutual professional respect, born of neither of us moving. Then the elevator opened, and Renata Voss walked out, clearly intending to leave through the lobby, and equally clearly not expecting me. She was 38, I guessed. Dark hair pulled back with the efficiency of someone who had stopped caring about its aesthetic effect. She was thin in the way of people who forget to eat when preoccupied, and she was very obviously preoccupied. She had the eyes of someone who has been running calculations continuously for 4 days and hasn't liked any of the results. She looked at me and knew immediately that I was not a coincidence. "You're from Wolfe," she said. "Archie Goodwin." I extended my card. She took it without looking at it. "I'd like to talk to you about Douglas Fenner." "I have nothing to say." Ms. Voss, I said, pleasantly, I understand the impulse, but the police currently believe Edmund Halstead killed Douglas Fenner, and within the next 24 to 48 hours, they're probably going to arrest him. Mr. Wolfe doesn't think Halstead did it. Mr. Wolfe tends to be right. But he needs information, and right now you're the most informed person who isn't talking. She looked at me for a long moment. Something moved behind her eyes, something complicated that I couldn't quite name. Not here, she said. We walked to a coffee shop on Broadway. She sat across from me in a booth, wrapping both hands around a cup she didn't drink from, and she talked, carefully, precisely, with the control of a woman who had decided exactly how much to say, and was not going to be moved beyond it. She confirmed the LLC. She had known about it for 18 months. Fenner had brought her into the picture as a technical participant. Her name appeared in one filing as an analyst of record, a formality that had seemed minor at the time and had since become less so. Were you a partner? I asked. No. He told me it was a structural arrangement to give him more flexibility. I believed him. She paused. I was wrong to believe him. Did you know about the scale of it? 40 million? She looked at her coffee. I knew it was substantial. Did Halstead know? Not until recently, I don't think. When he filed the board complaint, Douglas told me Halstead was bluffing, that he didn't have enough information yet. Then something changed. About 3 weeks ago, Douglas became tense, more than usual. She looked up. He told me Halstead had found something. He didn't say what. There it was, the thing that changes a theory into a shape. Fenner thought Halstead was about to expose the LLC in litigation. I said, I think so, yes. And that gave Fenner a motive to settle quickly, or to prevent the litigation from proceeding. She said it quietly, with the look of a woman who has thought about what those words mean and doesn't enjoy it. I walked back to the brownstone in the kind of October wind that New York saves for moments when it wants to make a philosophical point about transience. I had gone to find Renata Voss and gotten more than I'd expected, which is usually a sign that you've touched something real. What I had now was a picture of Fenner's situation 3 weeks before his death, exposed financially, facing ruinous litigation, with a co-conspirator in Prine and an unwitting one in Voss, and a business partner who had finally found the lever to destroy him, which meant that Halstead's motive for murder had just gotten considerably murkier, and everyone else's had gotten considerably clearer. I reported all of this to Wolfe that evening, over coffee in the office. He listened, ate a plum, and sat in silence long enough that the room acquired the quality of a held breath. The paperweight, he said at last. What about it? If Halstead had discovered the LLC and intended to proceed with litigation that would expose it, he had no reason to kill Fenner. He had every reason to keep him alive and walk him into a courtroom. He pressed his fingertips together. The paperweight was placed. I thought so too. It was placed by someone who wished to implicate Halstead. Someone who knew the paperweight was Halstead's, knew it was in that office, and used it deliberately. He opened his eyes fully. Which means the murder was not impulsive. It was arranged. Outside, the wind had picked up. I could hear it finding the edges of the window frames, which Fritz regards as a personal affront, and Wolfe treats as atmospheric accompaniment. Tomorrow, Wolfe said, I want all of them here. Miriam Halstead, Edmund Halstead, Renata Voss, Gerald Prine, and Marcus Fenner, if he can be reached. Marcus is in Chicago. Chicago has airports. He picked up his book. Make the calls, Archie. Getting all 4 of them into Wolfe's office at the same time was a logistical exercise that required 2 hours of phone calls, 3 degrees of implied threat, and 1 outright lie. I told Gerald Prine that Wolfe had information about the LLC that he intended to share with Inspector Kramer by Friday, unless Prine came in on Thursday afternoon and helped him understand the context. Prine was in the office at 3 o'clock, with the punctuality of a man who has spent his career managing exactly this kind of leverage. Miriam and Edmund Halstead I handled directly. They came together, which I expected. Edmund had the expression of a man determined to be useful. Miriam had the expression of a woman determined to let him. Renata Voss I collected in person, in the lobby of her building. She came without argument, which told me she had been sitting with her decision since our coffee shop conversation and had made it. Marcus Fenner had in fact flown in the previous night. His father's estate required his presence regardless of their estrangement. And he was staying at the Pierre. I called him at 8 in the morning and introduced myself and Wolfe. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "I'll be there," without asking many questions, which told me he either already knew about Wolfe or had a particular kind of intelligence that doesn't need to. He was 32, darker than his photographs, and had his father's eyes without his father's charm, which may have been an improvement. He sat at the far end of the grouping of chairs Wolfe's office becomes on these occasions. Fritz and I arranged them before the event with the care of stage managers, and looked at the others with the composed watchfulness of a man attending a function he didn't choose and intends to survive. Wolfe came in at 4 o'clock precisely. He took his chair, looked at all of them in the way he has that makes each person feel briefly that they are the only one in the room, and folded his hands. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I will tell you what I know, and you will correct me where I am wrong. This is not a request." Prine, predictably, objected. He was a compact man in his late 50s, with the gray precision of a man who has spent decades being the smartest person in other people's crises. "This is highly irregular," he said. "I'm here as a courtesy." "I don't see—" "Mr. Prine," Wolfe said, "you went to Douglas Fenner's offices the morning after his death, before the police had secured his records, and attempted to access his correspondence files. That is a fact. The context of that visit and your financial relationship with Fenner Capital Management LLC will be of interest to the authorities, unless you provide me with a satisfactory explanation. You are here because the alternative is considerably less comfortable." He moved his gaze without hurry. The murder. The room was very quiet. Douglas Fenner was killed by someone who knew his house, knew his habits, and knew the significance of Edmund Halstead's paperweight. The murder was not spontaneous. It was arranged to appear as the product of a heated confrontation between Fenner and Halstead, exploiting the known tension between them over the dissolution of their partnership. He paused. The paperweight's placement demonstrates this. A person killing in anger does not set down the weapon with care. A person staging a scene does. Halstead said nothing, but something in his posture changed. A slight release, as though he'd been holding a breath he hadn't known he was holding. Wolfe continued. Fenner was killed between 7 and 10 Thursday evening. During that window, he was struck from behind initially, suggesting he turned away from someone he was not afraid of. Someone whose presence in his home office was unremarkable. I watched faces. Voss was still, looking at a point on the carpet. Prine was watching Wolfe, with the focus of a man looking for the telling move in a chess game. Marcus Fenner was watching his father's paperweight, which Wolfe had placed, rather deliberately, on the corner of his desk. 3 people in this room had significant reason to prevent Douglas Fenner from living to face litigation that would expose the structure and scale of Fenner Capital Management LLC, Wolfe said. Mr. Prine, whose financial stake in that vehicle was considerable, and whose legal exposure in its creation was severe. Ms. Voss, whose nominal participation created liability she may not have fully understood until recently. And Mr. Marcus Fenner, whose father had, I am told, similarly manipulated assets in the context of his late mother's estate. Marcus Fenner's expression didn't change. "You're suggesting I had a financial motive?" he said. His voice was level and precise. "I'm noting that your father's death, at this particular moment, disrupts a litigation process that might have uncovered not only the LLC, but the earlier manipulation of your mother's estate, which, depending on how it was structured, might have given you grounds for a claim." Claims that cannot be made against a living man who is in the middle of defending himself in other litigation are sometimes easier to pursue against an estate. That's a remarkable construction, Marcus said. Yes, Wolfe agreed. It is also not an accusation. It is an enumeration of interests. He looked back at Prine. Mr. Prine, what were you looking for in Fenner's files? The pause was long enough to be a small drama in itself. Prine looked at the Halsteads, then at Voss, then at Wolfe. Douglas asked me some months ago to manage the dissolution of the LLC in the event of his death. I had the documentation for this. I went to the office to ensure the corresponding files on his end were organized, that they reflected the correct arrangement. To ensure they reflected the arrangement he had instructed you to maintain, Wolfe said. Yes. Not to remove anything inconsistent with that arrangement. Another pause. No. Wolfe looked at him for 3 seconds. I don't believe you, he said pleasantly. But I don't need to at this moment. Ms. Voss. She looked up from the carpet. When you last spoke with Douglas Fenner, what did he tell you about the status of his discussions with Edmund Halstead? She breathed. He said Halstead had found the LLC registration. He said he was going to offer Halstead a settlement, enough to go away quietly. He said he had a meeting arranged. With Halstead? He didn't say. When was this conversation? Wednesday evening, the day before he was found. He told you he had a meeting arranged for Thursday. He didn't specify when. He said he was going to resolve it. Wolfe was quiet. The room had the quality of a held note. Mr. Fenner, he said, looking at Marcus, when did you arrive in New York this week? Marcus met his eyes. Wednesday evening. Not last night as I was told. A pause. I arrived Wednesday. I stayed at a hotel in Midtown. I flew in because my father's attorney, he glanced at Prine, had contacted me about the estate situation and indicated my presence would be needed. Prine contacted you before your father's death, Wolfe said. The air in the room shifted. 2 days before, Marcus said. His voice remained level, but something behind it had changed. He told me there was a situation developing with the estate arrangements that I should be aware of. He said my father's affairs were complicated and that I should come to New York. Wolfe nodded once, slowly. Mr. Prine, he said, you called Marcus Fenner 2 days before his father's murder and asked him to come to New York. Prine's expression was the carefully constructed blankness of a man who is deciding at speed how much of a particular road he is willing to walk down. I contacted Marcus regarding estate arrangements that had been in discussion for some time. You contacted him because you anticipated an event that had not yet occurred. I contacted him because, Mr. Prine, Wolfe's voice had gone very quiet, which is more alarming than when it is loud. I will ask you a precise question, and I want a precise answer. Did you contact Marcus Fenner before Douglas Fenner's death because you had reason to believe Douglas Fenner's death was imminent? The silence that followed was one of the longer ones I've sat through in that office, and I have sat through several that felt geological. Prine said, I want to speak to my attorney, which was, I reflected, both an answer and not one. Wolfe looked at me. I looked at Wolfe. He said mildly, perhaps we will pause here. After the group dispersed, Prine departing with the contained fury of a man storing it for future use. The Halsteads, with the careful relief of people who have seen something important happen without being sure what it was. Voss, with her eyes on the floor, and Marcus Fenner, with a composed stillness that I found more troubling than anger. I went back to work. The thing about Prine contacting Marcus 2 days before the murder was the kind of detail that cracked open a case or cracked open a theory, and the distinction mattered. It could mean Prine had known the murder was coming. It could mean Prine had planned the murder. It could also, if I wanted to be rigorous about it, mean that Prine had anticipated some other crisis, perhaps Halstead's anticipated legal strike, and been preparing for its consequences. I went to the Hall of Records, and then to the county clerk's office, and spent 2 hours looking at filing dates, which is the kind of thing that sounds tedious and is tedious, but occasionally tedious things tell you what happened. What the filings told me was this: Fenner Capital Management LLC had been structured so that in the event of Douglas Fenner's death, the management authority transferred immediately to a successor manager. The successor manager named in the documents was not Gerald Prine. It was a shell entity, incorporated in Delaware 18 months ago, whose registered agent was an attorney I did not know, whose principals were not publicly disclosed, and which, when I ran the registered address, turned out to share an office suite with 3 other entities, one of which was a consulting firm, whose principals included, with the indirection of a man who knows how to not have his name on things, a reference that led, after 20 minutes of cross-referencing, to Marcus Fenner. I stood on the courthouse steps in the October afternoon and looked at that piece of paper for a long moment. Then I called Wolfe. "The successor entity in the LLC," I said. "It traces back to Marcus." Silence. Fenner set it up so that if he died, the LLC's management went to a vehicle his son controlled. More silence, of a different quality. "Prine drafted the documents," I said. "He knew the structure. He knew that Marcus inherited the management authority, and with it, control of $40 million in assets, the moment his father died. And he called Marcus to New York 2 days before that death," Wolfe said. "Yes. Archie," he said, "find out where Marcus Fenner was Thursday evening." "I'll try." "Don't try. Succeed." I walked to the Pierre. Marcus Fenner was not in his room. I left my card with the front desk and then sat in a lobby bar and called the one contact I have at a midtown hotel who owes me a favor from an incident involving a disputed room charge and a misplaced envelope of cash, and asked her to check whether Marcus Fenner had used his key card to enter or exit the Pierre on Thursday evening. She called me back in 20 minutes. Marcus Fenner's key card had last been used at 6:48 p.m. on Thursday to exit the hotel. It had next been used at 10:22 p.m. to re-enter. The medical examiner had placed Fenner's death between 7 and 10. I ordered a club soda, thought about it, and then thought about Prine again. Because here was the thing. Marcus Fenner had the inheritance motive. He had the structural motive. The LLC management authority. He had the opportunity. And he had arrived in New York 2 days early, at Prine's invitation. But Prine had drafted the documents. Prine had called Marcus. Prine had rushed to the office to get into the files. Prine had been Fenner's attorney for 15 years, and had watched him manipulate, cheat, and construct an empire of bad faith, and had helped him do it. Was Prine a man who had enabled murder, or a man who had anticipated the consequences of a situation he had himself helped create, and was now trying to manage the fallout? Those were 2 very different things, and one of them was considerably worse. I went back to the brownstone and gave Wolfe the keycard times. He sat with them. "Marcus had opportunity," I said. "Yes." "And Prine called him to New York." "Yes." "Are they together in this?" He was quiet for a long time. "I don't know," he said, which was unusual enough that I wrote it in my notebook on general principle. "There are 2 possible structures. In one, Prine and Marcus conspired. Prine arranged the opportunity, Marcus executed it. Both benefit from the LLC management authority and the elimination of the litigation threat. In the other, Prine anticipated that Marcus, once informed of the estate situation, might act, and called him to New York, knowing what might result. Perhaps not explicitly planning it, but not preventing it. The second one is almost worse. The second one is considerably more difficult to prove." He looked at the window. "But there is a third possibility I have not yet eliminated." I waited. "That Marcus did not kill his father," he said, "and that whoever did was counting on the evidence pointing at someone who was conveniently present and conveniently motivated." "You're saying Marcus could be a patsy." "I'm saying the case has 2 layers of frame. One pointing at Halstead, one pointing at Marcus. And that architecture is either the result of extraordinary coincidence or deliberate construction. He pressed his fingertips together. The paperweight implicates Halstead. The inheritance structure and the key card implicates Marcus. But both pieces of evidence are available. They are there to be found by anyone who looks, including the police. The police are focused on Halstead. They have not yet looked at Marcus. When they do, he paused. Archie, who benefits most from Douglas Fenner's death if neither Halstead nor Marcus is the killer? I thought about it. Renata Voss, I said slowly. She was in the LLC. If Fenner died and the management went to Marcus's entity, her participation in the vehicle would be scrutinized. But if the LLC is dissolved in the chaos of murder investigations and estate litigation, her exposure might be minimized, he said. Yes, but that is a benefit, not a sufficient motive. He shook his head. No, there is still something I do not see. Tomorrow I need to see it. He picked up the East India book. Get me the complete terms of the LLC operating agreement, he said. All of it, not just the succession clause. I reached for the phone. The operating agreement arrived via a contact who had a contact who had a relationship with a filing service that operated in the interesting space between rigorous and expedient. At 7 the following morning, I was on my second coffee. Wolfe was still upstairs with his orchids. I read it at my desk. By the time Wolfe came down at 11, I had 3 pages of notes, and a theory that I found simultaneously satisfying and disturbing. The LLC's operating agreement was 38 pages of Delaware boilerplate, with 6 pages of custom provisions that were, in the manner of custom provisions drafted by clever lawyers, anodyne on the surface and complex underneath. The succession clause gave Marcus's shell entity management authority upon Fenner's death. But 3 pages later, a separate clause, titled simply Dissolution Events, specified that the LLC would automatically dissolve and its assets distributed to the named beneficial owners in the event of certain triggering conditions, one of which was defined, with a specificity that I found notable, as initiation of legal proceedings by any partner of Halstead Fenner Capital LP against any officer, member, or manager of this LLC. In other words, if Halstead sued, the LLC dissolved, and the money was distributed immediately. I read that clause 4 times to make sure I had it right. Then I went and found the filing date. The LLC had been established 3 years ago. The dissolution clause had been added by amendment 14 months ago. I put my notes in front of Wolfe. He read them without speaking for 7 minutes, which I measured. The amendment, he said. 14 months ago, after Halstead filed the board complaint. Yes. The dissolution clause was added in response to the legal pressure, he said, in anticipation of Halstead eventually pursuing litigation. It was a safety valve. If the lawsuit came, the LLC dissolved, and the assets were distributed before they could be seized or included in the litigation. Which means Fenner didn't need to die to protect the LLC, I said. If Halstead sued, the dissolution clause would have fired automatically. The money would have been distributed to the beneficial owners. Wolfe looked up. Who are the beneficial owners? I had looked. There were 3. Fenner holding 60%, Prine holding 25%, and a third party holding 15%, identified in the document by a trust name, the Carwell Trust, which I had not yet traced. The Carwell Trust, I said. I can't trace it from the document alone. I'd need time we may not have, but it means they have information about who is. Because whoever killed Fenner killed him before the lawsuit, preventing the dissolution, preventing the Carwell Trust distribution. Yes, he folded his hands. Someone deprived the Carwell Trust of $6 million by killing Fenner at the wrong moment. The Carwell Trust knows this. I looked at him. You want me to find who controls the Carwell Trust? I want you to find who controls the Carwell Trust with some urgency, he said. Because when you do, I believe we will have a witness. The Carwell Trust took me 3 hours and a call to a probate attorney in New Jersey who, for a retainer I did not disclose to Wolfe until the expense report was submitted, was willing to discuss the trust's formation history. The Carwell Trust had been established 7 years ago. Its grantor, the person who had established it, was not Douglas Fenner. It was Fenner's ex-wife, Caroline Fenner. The trust's current trustee and sole beneficiary, following Caroline Fenner's death from cancer 2 years ago, was her son, Marcus Fenner. I sat in a coffee shop on Lexington Avenue for 10 minutes without moving. Marcus Fenner was both the successor manager, through his shell entity, and the 15% beneficial owner, through the Carwell Trust. If Fenner had died before Halstead sued, Marcus got management control. If Halstead had sued first and triggered dissolution, Marcus got 15% of the distribution, $6 million, but no management control. The first outcome was worth more in the long run. The second was guaranteed money now. But here was the thing that rewrote the whole picture. Marcus hadn't killed his father to get the better outcome. If he had, he would have ensured Halstead never filed the lawsuit. But Halstead was still alive, still represented by lawyers who were still building a case. The lawsuit was still coming. So either Marcus had killed his father and failed to account for the lawsuit, which was possible if he'd panicked, or Marcus hadn't killed his father and someone else had. I called Wolfe. Marcus controls both sides of the LLC equation, I said. Silence. He gets more from management control than from dissolution. But the lawsuit is still coming, which means if he killed his father, he still ends up with dissolution and not control. Unless, Wolfe said slowly, he has a method of preventing the lawsuit that does not involve Halstead's death. What method? A settlement. If Halstead's case was settled, adequately, convincingly, the lawsuit would be withdrawn. The LLC would not dissolve. Management control would persist. A pause. Has anyone offered the Halsteads a settlement in the past 4 days? I thought about it. Miriam Halstead had been in our office discussing her husband's imminent arrest. She hadn't mentioned a settlement offer. I'll check, I said. I called Miriam Halstead. She answered on the second ring. Mrs. Halstead, I said, in the past 4 days, has anyone approached you or your husband about a financial settlement related to the LLC? A pause that told me everything before she spoke. Yes, she said. Yesterday afternoon, we received an offer, through an intermediary, not identified, for a settlement of $3 million in exchange for withdrawing any and all litigation related to Halstead Fenner Capital and its associated entities. Did you accept it? Edmund wanted to discuss it with you first. I thanked her and called Wolfe back. There's a settlement offer, I said, $3 million, through an anonymous intermediary, arrived yesterday. Wolfe was very quiet. Marcus killed his father, he said. He killed him before the lawsuit could trigger the dissolution clause. He has now offered the Halsteads enough money to make the lawsuit disappear. If they accept, he retains management control of $40 million. His father's murder has netted him, conservatively, the management fees on $40 million for the foreseeable future, versus a one-time $6 million distribution. I thought about it. It fit. Every piece of it fit. Prine called Marcus to New York, I said. Yes, but Prine may not have known what Marcus intended. Prine called him about the estate situation, the legitimate estate matters, separate from the LLC. Marcus came to New York with his own purpose. Or Prine knew exactly what was coming. Yes, or that. He took a breath. Archie, I need one more thing. The Carwell Trust. Is Marcus the sole beneficiary, or are there other parties? Sole beneficiary, according to the attorney. Then Marcus had no obligation to share the dissolution proceeds. All $6 million would have been his. And he chose management control instead. That is not the choice of a man who needed money. That is the choice of a man who wants power. He was quiet for a moment. Tomorrow, he said, I want them all back, and I want Inspector Kramer here. Getting Kramer was easier than I expected, because Kramer, whatever his views about Wolfe's methods, is a practical man who prefers solving murders to not solving them. And I told him straightforwardly that Wolfe had the answer, and was prepared to deliver it in his office the following afternoon, with all relevant parties present, or via written memo to Kramer's commander. Kramer chose the former, with the speed of a man who has had the latter experience, and found it unsatisfying. Getting Marcus Fenner back was harder. He had apparently been warned, by Prine I suspected, or by whatever instinct had kept him composed through the previous meeting, that the situation was developing in a direction he would not enjoy. He did not answer his hotel phone. He did not answer the number I had for him. Wolfe told me to go to the Pierre and sit in the lobby until Marcus appeared. I sat in the Pierre lobby for 2.5 hours. I drank 2 coffees, read a newspaper, and declined to be seated in the restaurant twice. At 3:45, Marcus Fenner came through the revolving door from the street, with the focused look of a man who has been somewhere and done something and is now processing the results, and found me standing between him and the elevator. He looked at me. Mr. Wolfe wants to see you tomorrow at 2 o'clock, I said. Inspector Kramer will be present. He looked at me with the contained watchfulness I'd come to associate with him. Am I under arrest? Not yet. Then I don't have to come. No, I agreed, you don't have to, but Wolfe is going to lay out the whole picture tomorrow, with or without you, and I think you know enough about how these things work to understand that being present is better than being discussed in absentia. I paused. Also, frankly, he might be wrong about 1 or 2 things, and you'd want the opportunity to correct him. Something moved behind his eyes. It might have been calculation. It might have been something closer to relief. The particular relief of a man who has been carrying something alone for several days and is tired of it. 2 o'clock, he said. I went back to the brownstone and told Wolfe it was arranged. He nodded and asked me to confirm the others. Prine required a second call, during which I mentioned specifically that Wolfe intended to address the question of the Carwell Trust and its relationship to the LLC dissolution clause. Prine said he would be there. Renata Voss said yes without hesitation, which told me she had decided, over the course of the previous day, that her best outcome lay in cooperating rather than waiting. The Halsteads said yes. That evening, Wolfe ate exceptionally well. Fritz had produced a beef bourguignon that deserved a better occasion, and spent 3 hours in the office writing notes in his precise, cramped longhand. I reviewed my own notes and confirmed the sequence of events as I now understood it, looking for the gaps, the places where the logic required a step that the evidence didn't quite support. There was one, the actual entry into Fenner's townhouse. Marcus's keycard placed him out of the Pierre between 6:48 and 10:22. Fenner's townhouse was 20 minutes from the Pierre by cab. The timing fit, but we had no evidence that Marcus had been in the townhouse. The rear garden exit suggested someone who knew the house well enough to leave through the back, and Marcus, estranged for years, might not have known the layout. I brought this to Wolfe. He would have visited as a child, Wolfe said. The townhouse was the family home during his parents' marriage. He would know the layout. You're assuming Fenner kept the townhouse from the marriage. Wolfe looked at me. Find out. I called Miriam Halstead, who called a contact in the Fenner social circle, who confirmed that Douglas Fenner had purchased the townhouse from the estate of his first mother-in-law 12 years ago, which was 2 years before his marriage to Caroline, Marcus's mother, and that Marcus had in fact lived there for 3 years during his parents' marriage. He knew the house. The gap closed. I also, in the morning, before the meeting, made one additional call to a private investigator I know in Chicago who handles financial background work. I asked him to check whether Marcus Fenner had made any unusual financial movements in the past 6 months. He called back at noon with one item. 8 months ago, Marcus had liquidated a personal investment account worth approximately $900,000 and transferred the proceeds to a newly opened account at a bank in the Cayman Islands. $900,000. About what you'd need to hire the right kind of help for a project you didn't want traced. Or about what you'd put aside if you were planning to be unavailable for a while. I gave this to Wolfe 15 minutes before 2 o'clock. He read it, nodded, and said, "Good. Now we proceed." They arrived within 15 minutes of each other, which Fritz managed with the diplomatic precision he applies to all household logistics. Kramer came first, which was predictable. He is a punctual man with a constitutional distaste for being the last to know anything. He sat in the front chair, and looked at me with the expression he saves for occasions, when he is simultaneously hoping Wolfe is right and hoping he isn't, because the former means a solved case, and the latter means one less humiliation. "How long is this going to take?" he asked. "As long as it takes," I said, which is not the answer he wanted. The Halsteads came together, then Renata Voss, then Prine, who looked at Kramer with the precise calculation of a lawyer doing rapid real-time assessment of personal exposure. And finally Marcus Fenner, who came in last, nodded to no one, and took the chair farthest from Kramer, without appearing to choose it deliberately. Wolfe entered, settled, looked at all of them. "Douglas Fenner," he began, "was murdered by a person who had both intimate knowledge of his financial arrangements and a specific, calculable interest in the timing of his death. The timing was not incidental, it was the essence of the crime. Kill Fenner before Halstead's lawsuit was filed, and the LLC's management authority transferred intact to a successor. Allow the lawsuit to proceed, and the LLC dissolved, distributing assets and eliminating the management authority entirely." He paused. "The murderer chose timing over the certain distribution of $6 million. It is the choice of a man who thinks in years rather than in months." Prine began to speak. Wolfe looked at him, and he stopped. "Mr. Prine contacted Marcus Fenner 2 days before the murder, and asked him to come to New York. He will tell us this was regarding estate arrangements. I believe that is partly true, but Prine also knew the state of Halstead's legal preparations, because he had reviewed documents for Douglas's defense. He knew a lawsuit was imminent. And he knew that if the lawsuit was filed before Douglas died, the LLC dissolved, and his own 25% share, $10 million, was distributed and closed. No ongoing management, no future fees, a single payment." He folded his hands. Prine wanted the LLC to survive. He wanted management to continue. He had the same interest Marcus had in Douglas dying before the lawsuit. Kramer was watching Prine with the expression of a man revising a conversation he'd planned to have. "But Prine did not kill Douglas Fenner," Wolfe said. The room shifted. He called Marcus to New York. He provided the information. He allowed the circumstances to develop. Whether he explicitly encouraged what followed, I cannot say with certainty, and I will not accuse him of what I cannot prove. What I can say is that Prine went to the offices the following morning, to secure Fenner's files, not to protect Douglas's interests, but to protect his own, and to remove evidence of the LLC structure before the police could trace it. He looked at Prine. "You knew what had happened. You didn't know it before it happened, or if you did, you chose a calibrated ignorance, but the morning after, you knew." Prine's expression had achieved a flatness that was itself a kind of answer. Wolfe turned to Marcus Fenner. "You came to New York on Wednesday evening," he said. "You left your hotel at 6:48 on Thursday. Fenner's townhouse is 20 minutes from the pier. You know the house. You lived there during your parents' marriage. You entered through the front door, which your father opened, because your presence was not alarming to him. Despite your estrangement, a visit from his son, in the context of the developing estate situation, would have been unremarkable, possibly even expected." Marcus was very still. "You used the paperweight deliberately. It was on his desk. You had seen it there when you entered. recognized the engraving, understood immediately that its use would direct suspicion toward Halstead. You struck him from behind as he turned, perhaps toward the window, perhaps toward the door, and then from above as he fell. You exited through the rear garden, which you knew from childhood. You returned to the Pierre by 10:22. "This is speculation," Marcus said. His voice was still level, still controlled. "Some of it," Wolfe agreed. "The keycard times are not speculation. Your knowledge of the house is not speculation. Your financial relationship with the LLC, as both successor manager and Carwell Trust beneficiary, is not speculation. The $900,000 you transferred to the Cayman Islands 8 months ago is not speculation." A pause. "And the settlement offer you made to the Halsteads, through an intermediary, to withdraw the lawsuit that would trigger the LLC's dissolution, that is not speculation. It is the final piece. A man who had not killed his father had no reason to prevent that lawsuit. A man who had not killed his father had nothing to lose from the LLC dissolving. You offered the Halsteads $3 million of your own money to make the lawsuit disappear, because the lawsuit dissolving the LLC would end your control of $40 million in assets." The silence had a specific texture. I have sat through enough of these moments to know the texture. It is the silence of a person deciding whether there is still a move to make. Marcus Fenner decided there wasn't. He looked at Wolfe with what I can only describe as the exhausted respect of an opponent who has played well and lost. "I want an attorney," he said. "You have one," Wolfe said, glancing at Prine, "though his availability may shortly be complicated by his own situation." Kramer was already standing. He was looking at Marcus with the focused purposefulness that means he's assembled the warrant language in his head and is now simply executing it. "Marcus Fenner," he said. "Yes," Marcus said, not to Kramer specifically, to the room, or perhaps to himself. Renata Voss was looking at her hands. Edmund Halstead had his arm around his wife's shoulders with the unconscious solidity of a man who has been exonerated and hasn't quite processed it yet. Miriam Halstead was watching Marcus with an expression I could not entirely read. Something that was not triumph and was not sympathy, but occupied the complicated space between them. Prine did not move. He was calculating, still, the way he'd been calculating since he walked in. His calculation was going to consume the next several years of his life. After Kramer had taken Marcus out and the others had dispersed, Voss slipping away quickly, the Halsteads pausing to exchange a few quiet words with Wolfe, Prine departing without speaking to anyone, I sat down in my chair and looked at Wolfe. He had already reached for the beer Fritz had left at his elbow at some point during the proceedings. "The Carwell Trust," I said. "Did you know from the beginning that Marcus was on both sides of the LLC?" "I suspected from the moment you told me the trust structure," he said. "A 15% beneficial interest, established by his mother, held in his name. It was too precisely positioned to be coincidental. The question was what he did with the knowledge once he had it. He decided management control was worth more than $6 million in hand. He decided control was worth more than money. That is a particular kind of mind. He drank. His father had the same quality, in a different direction. Douglas Fenner spent 15 years building control, over the partnership, over the assets, over the people around him. He did it without violence. His son looked at the same impulse and drew a different line. The paperweight was clever, I said, using it. It was. It demonstrates premeditation. He saw it and made a decision in the moment. But it was also a kind of hubris. He believed that evidence pointing at Halstead would be sufficient. He did not adequately account for the possibility that someone would look at the evidence and ask why it was pointing quite so clearly. I thought about Cecilia Rourke and the way the paperweight had been placed, the small, self-undermining vanity of the arranged scene. He tidied up, I said, after. He put the paperweight down carefully. Yes, which told us the scene was constructed, and a constructed scene implies an architect. He set down the beer. He was intelligent but not wise. Intelligence without wisdom overestimates its own invisible hand. Fritz appeared in the doorway with the expression that means dinner is either ready or approaching readiness, and that the quality of the approaching readiness is such that delay would be a moral error. "Roast duck," Fritz said, with the quiet pride of a man announcing something real. "Excellent," said Wolfe, and the case of the Gilded suspect was, for him, complete. For me, there was still the paperwork. Reports for the Halsteads, an expense accounting that required some artful explanation of the New Jersey probate attorney's retainer, a follow-up conversation with Stebbins about the settlement offer and how it figured into the evidentiary picture. Marcus Fenner was charged 2 days later. Prine was eventually named as a co-conspirator in a separate proceeding, though the question of what he knew and when was, as Wolfe had predicted, considerably more difficult to prove than the rest of it. Renata Voss cooperated fully with the investigation into the LLC's history, and received, in exchange, a lenient outcome that she appeared to accept with the quiet relief of someone who has been waiting to be caught, and is surprised to find the catching a form of release. Edmund Halstead, freed from the threat of arrest and the dissolution of his partnership, pursued his legal claims against the Fenner estate with the patient, methodical energy of a man who clips coupons and does not forget what he is owed. He settled eventually for a sum that Miriam described to me over the phone as adequate, which in the register of that particular marriage I interpreted as a significant victory. Wolfe received his fee and returned to his orchids, which were apparently less ungrateful than they had been the previous week. I went back to the crossword. The city outside continued its business of being the city, indifferent, particular, and full of people drawing lines in different places and telling themselves the line is where it belongs. It is, I have found, the universal condition. We just happen to get paid to notice when the line moves.